All right, Kent, thanks for joining me. And we just spoke a little bit about my background, but you said it was okay to record, so I wanted to start doing that. And if you want to talk about anything specific, that'd be great. But I really just wanted to reach out to you because I'm a huge fan of your work and the other Meet Poets, and I'd love to see more interviews and stuff preserved for other people. So I have some questions if you wanted
Yeah,
to go from
fire away.
there.
Whatever.
Yeah, cool, man. I mean, the basics, I would just say, do you want to talk about your childhood at all and how maybe you got into poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you specifically how poetry was the furthest thing from my mind until college. We were, in those days, I'm 84. I was born in 1940, so I'm old as fuck. So anyway, when
You sound like a young man to me, my friend.
people think I'm in my 40s, but I'm
I
84.
can tell.
Anyway, I never had any interest in poetry. I read really early from what my mother told me, and I always read a lot of books, but I never poetry didn't work for me. And what we were taught in like high school was Wordsworth and crap like that didn't interest me. If we'd been reading Hart Crane or Bukowski, been a different story. So I was pre-med major. My freshman year at Ohio Wesleyan, I was 17 years old, and some guy from Brooklyn, for who knows what reason, came to me and said, "You got to read Kerouac's On the Road and Ginsberg's Howl." Didn't know a clue what he was talking about. Read them both, totally changed my life. I ended up going to med school just briefly, but I started writing immediately because of reading On the Road and Howl. It just blew the top of my head off. So that's how I started writing at 17. So
Wow,
so many colleagues, they were writing in Levy was writing in high school. No, I wasn't a prodigy. Absolutely not.
that's really cool, man. I remember being exposed to the beats at a young age as well. The famous On the Road and Howl. And I really did feel like those were the greatest minds of a generation, you know.
Well, it was
Very,
just different from what I had been going through, like in high school and even in college. No one was teaching them. But to read Kerouac, to read On the Road in 58, 59, and How in 58. On the Road had only been out about a year. He tried to get it published for about 5 years before I think Viking took it. It just was so powerful to read those books close to the time they were published.
yeah, that's really mind-blowing and dovetails really well into my next sort of set of questions. In 1958, I think it was University of Chicago, but Allen Ginsberg read Howl, and I think he was arrested.
Well,
Like that?
he read How a famous reading at a gallery in San Francisco, but I don't know about the Chicago reading. I know there was a big flurry when Big Table, which was a magazine out of Chicago, as I recall, published a lot of the beats, and there was a big obscenity blow up with that. But I didn't know Ginsberg was reading there at the time.
I'm sure you're correct, and I'm crossing wires again this morning. Still drinking my first cup of coffee.
Nope, no
But
problem.
yeah, that's to me the most inspiring. Some of the most inspiring parts of these stories is that in 1958 you could get arrested for reading suggestive, homosexual, or politically subversive poetry. Didn't have the sort of freedom of speech that we enjoy today. Um, and that really brings me to my next set of questions. So how did you meet D.A. Levy and Blazek and the other Meet Poets?
Okay, well, Blazak I didn't meet until actually years later. I hitchhiked to Chicago at one point, and Blazak was living in Bensonville, which is a small town outside Chicago. And I tried to hook up with him. I remember I was riding the L all night, so I didn't have to pay for a hotel. And Blazak couldn't get into Chicago at that time, so I didn't meet Blazak until long after I came to California. I met him in Sacramento. Only time we've ever met, and I think he still lives in Sacramento. Levy, I can tell you a specific story. I had gone to med school just to make sure that wasn't where I wanted to go, and I quit after about 6 weeks. I'm back in Cleveland, and I've never met a poet. I've been published only my freshman year in 1959. I was published in my fraternity newsletter, and then I was published in the Ohio Wesleyan literary magazine. That was it. Never met a poet. My friends were all fine arts majors. They were all painters. There was no other poet on campus that could have told me what to do. So I was in a bookstore in Cleveland. This is probably very early in 63, probably December 62, January 63. And I pick up a magazine as I'm at the cashier, and it's freelance. I didn't know what this was. I looked at it and I thought, oh, this looks like somewhere I could submit to. And I figured it was out of New York or San Francisco, when it was out of Cleveland. And it had an address, 6005 Grand Avenue. It was Russell Atkins, who's a very famous black poet. So I don't know what possessed me, but I called him. I think his aunt answered the phone. And she said, I said, I'd like to meet, I guess I said, I'd like to meet Russell. I just, I don't know. I just latched onto this magazine. And Langston Hughes was one of the board of trustees. His name was on the back. So it had great pedigree, very important, out of the Harlem Renaissance magazine.
Right.
So anyway, I called and she said, "Oh, Russell doesn't see anybody until the afternoon." So then I guess she said, "Come later," and I came like at 1 o'clock. His aunt opens the door of the house at 6005 Grand Avenue. I remember his address. And Russell greeted me like I was a long lost brother. It was just unbelievable. He took me down the basement. His deceased uncle had built a huge model train layout, showed me the house, showed me his cats. And he said, "You got to come to the freelance next meeting of the freelance workshop." And I knew nothing about any of this except freelance was the name of the magazine. He said, "There's another young poet there you're going to absolutely hit it off with." So I go to the meeting and see this little dude across the way just staring at me. That was Levy, and we just hit it off. And so yeah, I met Levy, and it was about February '63, and he just bought his letterpress maybe a month earlier.
Wow. Um, D.A. Levy's, uh, you know, I think one of the greatest poets I've ever read. And I feel strongly that part one of Cleveland Undercovers starts with Impossible Cities, I believe, um, is is just the most criminally underappreciated piece of 20th century poetry. Um, I've already kind of divulged how I feel about his work. Is there any of his work that you feel strongly about in any
Oh,
way?
yeah, I actually also liked Cleveland Undercovers the best of his early work. I think Bells of the Cherokee Pony should be in every poetry anthology in the country. It's criminal, it isn't.
Yeah, it's
And then,
like Ginsberg quality. Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing. And then not all that long ago, but I don't think I read it at the time. Suburban Monastery Death Poem was very good. Um, I have never read Levy critically. He was just a friend, and he would give me everything he printed, and
Sure.
I never submitted to him. He always asked me for work. He never took unsolicited manuscripts. He used to have a notice in every issue of the Marijuana Quarterly, no unsolicited manuscripts accepted. So he would ask you for something, I'd give it to him, it'd be published like the next day. He just worked super fast. But I never
Nice.
have gone back and gone start to finish with Levy's material. I look at it once in a while, but I read it literally as it was being published back then.
That's so cool, man. And the marijuana quarterlies, I keep trying to get copies of those, but they're
They're
fantastically expensive.
Yeah, $500 I see on
Yeah,
ABE one right now.
300 is a good deal. Um, so DA Levy, again, we're just being recorded, so just an introduction to him a little bit, and please correct me if I mischaracterize or am wrong in any way. DA Levy was a Clevelander who
Yeah, Clevelander.
wrote
Went to James Rhodes High School.
amazing, amazing, and he was a Jew. He was
Yes,
Jewish. He was
half Jewish
um,
on his father's side.
okay, and he was involved in the counterculture movement. Would you say that?
Yeah, he started writing in high school, which I didn't. Neither of us asked much about our history with each other. But he started his early manuscripts are at Kent State University. And by the
Yeah.
way, I have a huge collection of Levy, but it's all in my archive at Cal Berkeley. So who knows? Maybe down the line you want to access it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about. I still need to meet up with Jeff Mazur, the Mazur Books, and get stuff from him in person as opposed to just by mail. My family moved to San Francisco many generations ago, so it'd be a good visit. Um, so D.A. Levy, he's a he's a little dude, right? And
Yeah, he's about
he's
5'7". I think I'm 5'8", but we were all uh, his cousin. By the way, I married Levy's cousin. Levy
oh
had two
wow.
cousins that he was as close to as his half brother. He was super close. In fact, at one point they lived across the street from each other. So my first
Hmm.
wife was Joan, and her brother was Lester, but we all called him Cuz. And Levy was real tight. So I was kind of like married into the family in an odd way.
Yeah, that's both beautiful and depressing considering how everything worked out.
Well, I
D.A.
should
Levy, go
interject
ahead.
right now that
Of
Levy was
course.
suicidal from the day I met him. He talked
Oh,
about
interesting.
suicide all the time. It was
Okay.
it's
Okay.
a lot of people are distressed that he died at 26, barely 26. The miracle is that he lived
That he
that
made it that long. Yeah.
exactly because he was suicide. Joni has told me that when they were little kids, he talked of committing suicide when he did what he needed to do, which I guess was right or whatever. So yeah,
Sure.
I knew he was not long on this soil for sure when I met him.
Wow.
He talked about it all.
Wow.
In fact, he said he had a lethal dose of Seconal on him at all time, so he could just check out if need be.
Wow. Well, an interesting man, and who left behind some really incredible work. And I think this is a great opportunity to segue into uh, Act Three of D.A. Levy's life, so to speak.
Sure.
So, in again, please interrupt, correct me if I'm wrong, or in any way riff on whatever I'm saying. 19, I don't have the dates in front of me. I'm really shooting from the hip here, but in 1966, Levy was reading a poem at the Asphodel bookstore when he was arrested for indecency. Um,
Actually, the reading was at a club in the basement of Trinity Cathedral. It's called the Gate. And
okay,
I don't think he was arrested at the time of the reading. In fact, he wasn't. He was arrested subsequent to it, but that was the reading. It was in 1966. And I was at the same reading. And he read a poem to a young kid who had written the poem. And this is
right.
where it got kind of muddy because he was hit for contributing to delinquency of a minor. I think the word was cocksucker, motherfucker. I'm not really sure what the word was, but the police had a 16-year-old girl recording the reading. So the police were talk about contributing to delinquency of a minor. The police used that poor girl in a way that no one today that couldn't go down today. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
supposedly what happened. And then
So she,
anyway,
sorry, go
go.
ahead. No, yeah, that's so the actual story, right? Correcting my mistakes. So, and all of this is in Zen and Concrete, right? In the compilation that came out in the 90s
Yeah,
of
yeah. I
D.A.
think
Levy's work.
a lot of that history is written down, but that's pretty well established. The gate readings were originally hosted by a fellow Cleveland poet named RJS, and he was like a teenager, I think, at the time. And then Levy, that's where I met him. I remember Levy introduced it to us, and I think we did 4 open readings, and they were all documented in Poets of the Gate, which Levy published the first issues of that. They kind of document who was reading and what reading, but those were the infamous readings where which led to the arrest and everything else. And then Jim Lowe was arrested, and they thought he was a drug dealer, and of course he wasn't. But they used that as a pretext and seized all of Jim's books. And I think I sent you that one reference that listed
Right.
the small thing. Yeah, and
Yeah.
Jim never took an aspirin. He never used drugs, and they thought he was a drug kingpin.
Oh man. Yeah. And I suppose it's at this point no one will know, but I often wonder if that's just something that they said in order to, you know, stifle free speech. But who knows? Maybe they truly believed those charges. I struggle
Well,
with stuff like
they
that.
were definitely stifling free speech because it was a music club called La Cave, and there's a book on La Cave that just came out about a year ago, and they had the same difficulty. So they were hitting anything involving the youth culture or the burgeoning youth culture or whatever. They were not just picking on the Asphodel or Levy; they were casting a wide net.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly how I feel about the policing of that era is that it was overzealous to the point where they felt like, well, if we just shake this tree, something will come out, and it's bound to be, very illegal because it'll be marijuana or something, or LSD or
And it
something.
wasn't, you know, I think we tended to think that it was just because Cleveland was a backward city. But Ed Sanders was having the same trouble in New York, where he published "Fuck You," a magazine of the arts. He was
Sure.
raided. I think Steve Richmond had trouble on the Pacific. So it was kind of happening all over in a way that we weren't that aware of at the time, I don't think.
Yeah, Ed Sanders' The Prison Poems is another favorite of mine, and his work with Charles Manson, The Family, that book, and
Yeah.
or published earlier actually in another book that I have called The Mind Fuckers, which is really fascinating, and it's another man that I really hope to talk to one day. Um, so DA Levy um, is indicted for indecency and contributing to the delinquency of a minor for essentially saying, cocksucker, motherfucker, some shit like that. It's the
And
kind of stuff. Mhm.
reading the kid was like
Right.
14, 16. He was
E-
reading his poem because the kid
Even better, he didn't even
read.
write it, right? It was
Yeah,
he went down for the homie, right? Took one for the team.
right, exactly.
So sad. And so a few days after reading this, Levy's arrested. And again, correct my understanding. I don't have the book Zen and Concrete right next to me, literally just going from memory here. But there was a fundraiser that, as I recall, you and maybe TL Chris organized.
I didn't organize it, but I read at it. I'm trying to think who organized it. I can't remember if Chris did. There were actually two fundraisers that I can remember. Ginsburg came to the one at
Right.
Case. That was the one and only time I met him. And the Fugs also performed.
Awesome. Do
So,
you want to talk about that day?
you know, there were multiple fundraisers, and I just remember that one was maybe the biggest. That one also had an interesting history. It was supposed to be at the Masonic Hall, and they found out what it was all about, and they canceled on it. So it ended up being held at Case Western Reserve University at Strosecker Auditorium. But there's a flyer actually kind of making the rounds now that lists the venue as the Masonic Hall, but they canceled because it was a political hot potato.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. So, um, do you want to talk about Ginsburg at all? Did you have
Well,
any
no,
thoughts
I
about?
really don't did know Allen Ginsberg at all. Just we just met
Sure.
in passing. Yeah, I think I was sitting down and he was walking in to go on stage, and I don't know, maybe Levy introduced the two of us. I don't recall, but I didn't have any other contact with Ginsberg except just meeting him that one time.
Awesome.
If I
Awesome.
could tell you about the asphodel, maybe you have a question about
Sure.
how.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, well, here's what happened. Levy and I went to the West Coast with an old high school friend of mine had the car, and the three of us went to the West Coast. This was just a few months after Levy and I met. This was probably May of '63, and Jim opened his store in April, but we didn't know anything about it, and nobody. And then Levy hitchhiked back to Cleveland, and I stayed in the West Coast and body surfed the whole summer. And came back around 1st of September, and nobody knew anything about Jim. He was up on the fourth floor of a big Italianate arcaded structure in downtown Cleveland. It's a gorgeous place. He was up in the fourth floor. So there was no walk through traffic. He never did any walk in trade. He sold mostly through the mail, you know, bookstores or institutions, I should say. Um, so anyway, he ran an ad, a little small ad about the size of a business card in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. This was around November of '63. And again, none of us knew anything about this. We were none of the freelance people, nobody had ever patronized and knew anything about it. It said modern first editions. So I bolted down there the next day, and I just was blown away by what he had. And I then told Levy and everybody else, and everybody kind of latched on to Jim. But we would never, I don't know if we'd ever found it if he hadn't run the ad in the paper. So it was just a fluke that we even found. Because remember, this is pre-internet, no social media, and he's up in the fourth floor of a building that no one would see him.
Sorry, I had my audio muted because I have a kitten here and she was trying to play with the keyboard. So, so how did so you said before that Jim Lowell, who's the owner and operator of the Asphodel bookstore in Cleveland,
Right.
was obviously not a drug dealer, wasn't selling weed. But he was raided uh, as a part of this indecency charge.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
because he
Because
carried
he
Levy's publications. He carried Marijuana Quarterly. A lot of those other items on that very brief list, I think I was in half a dozen of them, apart from the book of mine that was seized. So they just walked in, made a pretense of looking for narcotics, didn't find anything, and they walked off with, I think it was 5 or 7 cartons of books, which he never got back, by the way.
and
And they were all Levy publications, basically that kind of stuff. A few other things.
sure,
They just hauled almost all his Levy stock out of the shop.
fascinating. And it seems like the classic, McCarthy era stuff where you shake the tree
Absolutely,
and find something.
absolutely.
Yeah.
You got it.
Um, really too bad. Um, so and those were he wasn't charged with like being subversive politically. That was an indecency charge, right?
Well, I'm trying to think what Jim was formally charged with. I think Jim was probably charged with selling indecent material. Just
Sure, sure. Under the Mann Act.
and he got an ACLU help, and he finally, I can't remember the outcome. He never was convicted. I think he paid a fine, and Levy pled nolo contender or something. And Levy's attorney in the Con Petrochuk film on Cleveland kind of expressed his regret. He said, "I think we should have fought it harder because the city basically broke Levy. I think with the harassment. I think that absolutely was a contributing cause to Levy's suicide. Was the
It's
harassment?
certainly baked into his poetry, as far as I can
Yeah,
tell.
yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. So let's talk about that. It's very depressing, and anyone who may be listening, there's some talk of suicide.
Sure.
So, um, so Levy is convicted, and he is told that mm, mm, he was convicted of indecency. And as I recall, he was told he couldn't consort with minors.
Yeah, he had at the time there was a big fad of painting sometimes nude and underage women body painting, and somehow
Right.
he
I
got
have the Oz magazine that got
yeah
banned. I had, yeah.
he got into that. I'm not really clear on that because I was not. I mean, I had a wife and a child at this point. I was not
Sure.
in that scene, and Levy was very naive. Levy used some incredibly bad judgment at multiple times in his life. That was one of them. I think he's lucky he didn't get involved in prosecution on that basis because that stuff might have stuck. But anyway, the story I heard leading up to his suicide, he was living with his common law wife Dagmar, and supposedly he fabricated an argument to get her out of the apartment. The apartment was actually her apartment, I think, but he got her out of it. And I, what he'd done, he supposedly was going to go to California. In fact, Wagner got a postcard after Levy's death saying, "I'll be seeing you soon." So he called me up and said he wanted to borrow a suitcase. And I didn't have one, but I had a book or two of his that I wanted to return. So Levy's brother and Cuz and I drove, Levy's brother drove the three of us out to Levy's place. Can you still hear me? Something just kind of went off on my screen.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. So the three of us went to pay him a farewell visit because he's leaving Cleveland. This was not just a casual drop-in visit. So we go at the appointed time, and there was no answer at the door. And Levy was always punctual. So we knocked. We tried the door. It was locked. And I was uneasy, but I didn't know that he was dead. But it turns out he was dead inside at the time we're knocking on the door. So I go home and I actually wrote something, lines written a few hours before learning that D.A. Levy had shot himself to something like that. And then I get a call later that night, and Tom Chris said Levy had shot himself, and it turned out he was dead in the apartment when we were knocking on his door. So that was very weird.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. Um, there does appear to be an echo now. Just
You're coming through loud and clear.
okay. I can hear myself talking as well.
Okay.
So we'll see what happens. So
Okay.
excuse me. Well, I appreciate that story. It's very, very sad. So D.A. Levy, whose real name was Daryl, as I recall,
Yeah,
right?
Daryl is his first name. He's listed many places as Daryl Allen, but it turns out he was born Daryl Alfred, and he switched it to Allen. And I could tell you the background some other time. That's often a tangent, but yeah, he was born Daryl Alfred Levy, but it's usually I knew him as Daryl Allen Levy, but it was just D.A.
So people knew him as DA.
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah,
That's cool, man. Um, so I think the pop-up that came up on both of our screens was telling us that we only have a few minutes left in this meeting, because it's a Zoom. Um, so wrapping it up, but love to talk again, soon, anytime. But so DA committed suicide after he was convicted of indecency. That being said, he had suicidal ideation since childhood.
yeah, absolutely.
And it's
Early on, from what Joni tells me.
yeah, that's really, really too bad. But what he left behind was some, dare I say, criminally underappreciated poetry. And I think maybe we'll talk about that more another time because I think this thing will just cut out on us in a few minutes. But I feel like the next wave of this discussion, if you will, is where does D.A. Levy fit in and the other meat poets, you, Blazek, how do you feel like that movement is today? I mean, do you feel like it's well read? Do you feel like it will be read in the future? Do you feel like it's influential to art and culture today? Do you have any thoughts on the meat poets as a movement?
Well, it's strange you bring it up because in general, I think they're not that well known today. But one of the two people I do the monthly Zoom call with brought up Meat Poet like a month ago. I think it cut out. Can you still hear anything?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Hey, Kent, how you doing? Definitely seems like maybe it cut out. Hey, I'm here. You there? Okay, we may have lost Kent. I think he'll return, but we have about 4 minutes left on this call. So I would love to just wrap things up and maybe talk about how the meat poets, in my opinion, I mean, as I'm talking now, I can't hear you still, Kent. I'll let you know. But from my perspective, the meat poets are actually the one meat poet, right? Let's name him Charles Bukowski, is very, very well known, and I think his work is extremely influential today and will continue to be relevant for the few preceding decades at least. I think that anti-hero and this sort of thing are so popular today, I think misunderstood, but so popular today that the subversive work that Bukowski left behind can't be ignored by people who enjoy that type of material. And the interest in Bukowski will sort of grow into interest in his friends and the people that published him. I think Bukowski is very well known for The Genius of the Crowd, which was published first by D.A. Levy, is a very expensive mimeo for those of us who collect. And I think that simple connection will continue to, in some level, breathe life into the meat poets, the meat school of poetry. And I personally would love to see an anthology. I would love to have more conversations like this with other surviving meat poets, because I do think it's criminally underappreciated, but I actually think it is influencing society today through Bukowski. And when more people read Kent Taylor, Douglas Blazek, D.A. Levy, A.D. Winans, D.R. Wagner, Richard Kresh, Steve Solomon, the list just goes on. These are every single one of these people produced absolute works of genius that rivals that of Bukowski and is essentially unknown. So I don't know if I got you back, Kent, or if you heard any of that. But I had a really good time talking with you. Are you there? No problem, man. Hey, we've got about 1 minute left on this call. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out so you don't have to just listen to me in case, you're talking into the microphone and I just can't hear you. But it's been really, really great talking to you. Been a big fan of this movement, going back to studying poetry with Anne Tuttle in Stockton, who studied under um, Gerald Lockland, Jerry as we call him, and I get together with my poetry friends um, every Saturday here in Los Angeles, and I keep the Meet Poets alive personally. And I'm just so, so glad to have talked to you. And sorry it cut out here at the end, and I hope you don't feel like I'm talking at you, but had a really good time, and I hope to talk to you soon, bud. All right, bye now.